The pandemic is impacting nearly every aspect of daily life, including public transportation. We brought this up earlier. A new article in Wired takes a closer look at how major budget cuts to key services could ravage communities that depend on buses and subways every day. Aarian Marshall wrote the article, and she is a staff writer for Wired. Thank you so much for joining us. So I think, if you live in a city, it's pretty obvious that the pandemic has had a major impact on public transportation. There are just fewer people on buses and trains. But I want you to kind of give us a little bit of a bigger picture. Even before the pandemic, it seemed like public transportation was always going hat in hand to either the municipality or the state, just begging for additional funding. So what was the status of sort of public transportation in many cities before the pandemic? And then how did the pandemic exacerbate the issues?
Sure. So public transportation is, you're exactly right, like a lot of social services often arguing that they need much more funding than they have right now. And that's particularly true right now. The way that public transit funding works is different in every city, just like systems are different in every city. But every bit of funding is taking a hit right now. Some are more dependent on fares than others. Ridership is down about 70% across systems in the U.S. And then a lot depend on things like sales taxes, and people aren't spending as much right now because we're in a recession. So these public transit systems find themselves in a really difficult place right now. One transit official in New York said recently, this is a once in 100-year tsunami. It's a really bad situation.
Public transportation is one of those things that it's almost like, when the post office comes out with stamps, and if they say the stamps are going up like 5 cents, public transportation is going up 25 cents or 50 cents. People go, another 50 cents for the bus. Like people are really they react often badly to even minor increases in the fares. So what are some of the measures that cities are considering to deal with the problem?
Some are indeed thinking about fare increases, but others are saying they're going to have to make really dramatic cuts to service. And that could be really difficult for people to live within cities. In New York, for example, they're talking about cutting service between 40 and 50%. That would make, for some people, things like the subway and the bus totally unusable. In BART, San Francisco's BART, for example, they have they also have a deficit that they are going to, it looks like they're going to encourage people to retire early, some of their staffers, so they don't have to do layoffs. And in places like DC, where I am right now, they're talking about ending weekend service altogether and service at night. That's going to make it so difficult for people with jobs to just get around the city.
Yeah, when I heard about the DC transit system, I just thought about all those people who work late, who just don't have the option to drive in and out of the city. Parking is very expensive, even if you do have a car. In New York City, almost everyone takes public transportation. Doesn't really matter what your income is. But in a lot of other cities, public transportation really is something that people who cannot afford a car depend on. Who will these cuts impact the most, and what do they mean for the economy in some of these cities?
Absolutely. The public transit is part of the social safety net for so many cities, and especially for the essential workers that have kept our economy and towns and cities running during this pandemic. People who are staffing grocery stores, people who are on the front lines in hospitals and other healthcare settings. They need these systems to get to work, even either because they can't afford a car or because of disability or age can't drive one. So as a result, these problems could have cascading effects. Cities are networks. Things that affect one sort of employment and one certain set of people will eventually affect everyone in the city. So it's possible that these problems could compound themselves, and these places could find themselves in a really bad spot if public transit continues down the path it's been going for the last few months.
Yeah, in your article, you really identify sort of minor kind of quality of life shifts, like it takes you, twice as long to get to work because the buses or the trains don't run as frequently, or you're chronically late and that eventually costs your job. Well, that's not a minor. To sort of major shifts that people just choose not to live in certain places because the public transportation is just so poor. And you're talking about changing the landscape of a city, the population of a city. There is a bipartisan group of federal lawmakers. They have proposed a stimulus package that would include money for the country's public transit systems. What role can the federal government play in this? Can the federal government save public transportation in this country?
I think absolutely yes. The role of the federal government here could be to provide the funds that these systems are going to need to keep going. The American Public Transit Association says that across the country, systems need about $32 billion to keep going through the year. The proposal that's been floated around Washington proposes $15 billion to transit. Many say that's not enough to keep going, but they can use it as a stopgap for the next year or so. The CARES Act gave public transit $25 billion, really an amazing amount of money to keep transit going throughout the pandemic. These agencies are hoping that the Congress and the federal government will continue to be generous with them and keep these cities moving.
All right, fingers crossed. Aarian Marshall, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.